We are now live with the January 15th, 2020 meeting of the Node.js modules team. We are a group of 7 people on the call right now, although only 5 of them are active members of the team, meaning that we do not have quorum, although I do not believe that that will block any of the decisions or discussions, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. We have a handful of things on the agenda today. So, let's start with the top, work our way down, and then if there's extra time for other things, we'll add it as we go. I guess one thing, yeah, we'll get to it. We'll have time. So the first thing that we have in here from upstream is 31229, which is move ESM loaders to worker threads. This is a work in progress PR by Bradley Meck, who's not on the call right now. Does anybody have anything important to add for this agenda item, or should we punt since it's not super time sensitive work?
I just wanted to raise the point again from last week. Have we decided to go in that direction? And if so, should we get the dynamic instantation? I'm sorry, I always get that name wrong. That part of the loader hook, should that be removed sooner rather than later?
Okay, has that been brought up in that pull request, Corey?
I'm not sure it has. I brought it up in last week's meeting. I'll make a comment in the pull request.
So my understanding, but I could be wrong, is that the intention was always to move this stuff to the worker threads. So barring, like any strong reasons not to, I think from like a performance perspective, that was kind of like a long-term goal. So if there are things in the implementation which don't reconcile with that, I think it is prudent for us to do that sooner rather than later.
My question was going to be, are there any strong reasons to go one direction or the other? And Miles, it sounds like you gave one to go towards separate workers. Does anyone on the call have any reason why, or know of any reason why we wouldn't want to do it?
The only even half of a reason that I've heard is potential like performance savings you could get by cramming it all into one thread, but
I think the sync versus async, there may be some limitations there, but Wes, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I believe
we actually need it to be on separate threads for it to be sync, strangely enough.
Okay, cool. So I just wanted to make sure it wasn't at odds with the work that you've been doing.
No, we actually needed it to execute in separate realms because you need to use atomics.wait to wait on the stuff from the other realms, which you can only that way you can let the realms run independently, which you can obviously only do if they're in separate realms.
Okay, cool. So sounds like there's no explicit reasons to block progress on this, and for the sake of time in this meeting, I'd say we should move on to the next agenda item unless anyone has something else to add. Cool, thanks for the input, everyone. Next one we have is import meta resolve. That one is Guy Bedford, if you'd like to start, and then preemptively putting my hand up. Guy, to you.
Yeah, so we discussed this one last week, deciding if this is an API that we want to start shipping as an experimental API. Some hesitation to shipping something straight off, but I believe people were open to shipping something potentially flagged here. And then Miles, I think you did mention that you were possibly going to see if you could follow it up with Dominic and co there.
I had a call with Dominic, or I had a chat with Dominic in person yesterday. The one thing that he raised was a comment that you had pointed out, Guy, about the interactions of resolve with import maps, and specifically with like what happens when you like await dynamic import the result of resolve, and whether or not that could change behavior, which seemed like an inadequacy in the import map proposal. So he was going to go back and look at that, and we're going to like look at your comment one more time, because for those who are following, the idea would be import maps were kind of like one-to-one. So like the thing on the left maps to the thing on the right. So if you have a specifier, a URL on the left, it maps to, you know, a URL on the right. But what happens if that URL also maps on the left to another different URL on the right? I think based on the way the import map spec is currently, like symlinks, yeah, Wes, but I think that as import maps are currently specified, I don't think it follows all of those recursively, which my gut is that it should. The import map spec itself should. So like if something on the left is mapped to the right and that thing on the right also has a mapping from the left, like it should be following the whole thing. But that does introduce new complexities, especially related to like how you handle cycles and all of that. But I think for, you know, pun intended, those concerns need to be resolved. But overall, you know, Dominic was really positive about us breaking ground on this, was very interested in perhaps starting to maybe specify something in YCG and then bringing it to what working group when it's ready to be kind of adopted as a standard, and to kind of work on this as a joint effort between the web and Node from the get-go. I think that, yeah, I think like the one thing that we do need to figure out as part of this is the interaction between import meta resolve and import maps in order to move anything forward. But with that being said, he saw no concerns with us landing something behind a flag, so people can play with it and we could have a reference implementation.
That would be great. Sure. So, and in terms of other feedback on the API, does it mostly seem okay? So for example, we have the second argument, which allows you to customize the parent in the resolution, and it's async. So
yeah, I think having it be async was important. We did not get into the implementation details, but the impression that I got was that as long as it was behind a flag, that was something that we could kind of like hash out through the spec process, just like you would with anything else as you bring more stakeholders to the table. So, you know, I kind of feel like we should move forward with an API that we like as a group, and that can help lead the conversation as we introduce YCG and what working group. Jan?
I'm not sure if I posted in the PR. I definitely meant to. I do have some concerns about the second argument, especially because how it relates to loaders doing context-sensitive mapping, or specifically not mapping of URLs. Because having the second argument means that during resolution, you cannot do access control because anybody can impersonate any other URL during resolution. And then during fetching, we currently don't pass the original specifier, the original base. So you can't also not block there. So it makes it a little bit weird to block certain URLs from a source module using the loaders.
right. So the argument is if we want to treat loaders as being able to enforce security boundaries between modules through the resolver, where you just don't allow things to be resolved from certain modules, you're still able to resolve these modules and bypass the access control. But I mean, you'd still need to put it into dynamic import to actually do an execution. And in theory, that's the point where you'd want the access control if you actually have a truly secure system.
Right, but then we get into the challenge of re-resolving an already resolved URL. So it would always pass twice to all the resolution chains, which could be weird.
Right, and this is why I do think it's important that resolvers are very much idempotent.
I would like to interject that perhaps we're getting into implementation specifics that are better to be discussed on GitHub. Do folks agree with that?
Yeah, and my concerns were definitely nothing that has to stop an experimental version that can evolve over time from landing.
All right, so does anyone object to kicking the remainder of the conversation for now of an implementation behind a flag happening on GitHub and moving forward with the next agenda items? Cool. Looks like Wes had some good comments in the chat, so specifically just so we can get in the notes. It's about string path not being a reliable source for module identity. And so, yeah, what import meta resolve path, you're gonna like resolve twice. And that I think comes back to the concern around import maps. I think that this will be one of the most important bits to kind of work through as a group, especially as we think about the browser and how it all intersects. On to the next agenda item, unflagged conditional exports 31001. Guy, this is yours, I believe. Do you want to take this on?
Okay, so yeah, we've been discussing this one for a little while now. It's from the previous meeting where we had just merged the logical conditional ordering. At the moment, on 13, exports are shipped and they will work as objects. They will just always select the default key. And so as soon as we unflag conditional exports, we get the required, the import and the node keys and opening all those doors. So it'd be great to get it out. I mean, it's experimental feature on an experimental branch. You know, third being, what do you call it? A non-LTS, I guess.
Current release.
Right. So that people start using these features and getting feedback. We haven't had too much feedback yet, but yeah, it would just be good to get it out, I think.
Just before we start chatting here, just so everyone knows, we do have quorum now, so any decisions we make can be binding. The end of the last meeting, just for an update, was that we had the reviews upstream to land this and the general consensus in the group to land it, but Wes was not around, and Wes in particular the timing on this and specifically looking at different potential solutions. So Wes, not to like directly call you out, I'm sorry, but just want to make sure, like, do you have concerns or any feelings about like where we're at on this? Do you have any concerns about unflagging?
I mean, only the things I've already voiced, which like if no one agrees with me, no one agrees with me anyway, so.
Can you reiterate those so we can have them in the notes and just refresh people's memories, if you don't mind?
Just that, like, encouraging the pattern of shipping both a CommonJS and an ESM implementation of the same package under the same package name in the same package duplicates dependency trees for the foreseeable future until CommonJS support is dropped from every package, right? It's like, it's not a good transition path for as far as performance or runtime behavior is concerned. That's the issue I have. Like, yes, you are correct in saying that we can add require a VSM with the default condition after this, and so like the timeline of the two can be independent, but encouraging shipping two implementations is itself problematic for the ecosystem as a whole. And I've already voiced that concern. So
Okay. Thank you, Wes, for resurfacing those. I think in general, at least I can speak from my own perspective. I've viewed dual packages and conditional exports as to an extent, like a bit of a compromise on some of the principles that I started with. But I do think that there are a lot of benefits that do outweigh those concerns personally. But I absolutely hear you on that, and like especially the dual specifier hazard and some of the weird stuff that it can introduce is less than ideal. Is maybe a generous way of putting it.
I just don't look forward to the people who write like a server-side React rendering app where, like, because of how their libraries are set up, they end up including two separate copies of React, one ESM copy and one CJS copy, running two separate renderers that are each trying to render different fragments of the tree.
But wouldn't that only happen if React itself wasn't set up properly?
Ships both ESM and CJS files like it does?
Well, no, what do you mean? It currently has, it only has CJS right now.
It has
maybe somebody who has another.
It ships both of them. It just doesn't have an export map set up to expose the ESM to Node yet, but it probably will.
Well, I mean, what I assume that they will do though is do it correctly where it's an ESM wrapper as opposed to duplicating it, because their current approach that you're describing is one that was architected long before Node's ESM implementation was finalized. So like it's a good illustration, I think, of the type of problem that could happen. But I think for any popular framework, they're just going to fix it.
Could happen and is like endemic of every project structure that tries to ship ESM to be Webpacked or roll up today, right? So like
right again, and then I would suggest my position, my personal position on that is that is because both Rollup and Webpack have many years prematurely tried to deal with ESM in a Node environment, and now that Node has an actual implementation, my very strong expectation is that all of the popular frameworks, as well as all of the popular tools, are going to start adapting to match what Node ships. And so the problems you're describing are real, but they are caused by early adoption of non-existent standards, and they will be fixed by using approaches. Now, like the approaches that fit with Node's implementation. Now, I agree that all of the hazards you're talking about are conceptually valid and absolutely will happen somewhere, but I don't think they're going to happen at a large enough level that we have to be concerned about it.
I think we are vastly underestimating the amount of developer hours that will be wasted by this.
So I guess two things that I could throw out there that I think are worth considering here. And this is one that, like, not allowing this very, very specific behavior could still result in the same kind of dual graph stuff if there's manual entry points that people had to do, which was like more than likely the solution that people would land on. That was one of the points that Jan raised that like really convinced me to edge towards not being too protective over this. The second one is, all of this is still experimental and subject to change. Not that we want to pull the rug under from people, but things like a require ESM landing in the future, if we're able to reach consensus on an implementation, could relieve the need for utilizing this pattern. Better best practices could utilize it, and further, if over the next 6 months we start getting a lot of reports before we stabilize modules, as much as it would be painful to do, we could remove the behavior. So I obviously that is not the preferred way of doing it, but I do think that this offers enough convenience and enough of a mechanism for the ecosystem to align along patterns that aren't just about Node, that the benefits outweigh the potential concerns. And if those scales do change, we do have room to still make changes. But we really wouldn't know without shipping it, I guess is the main thing that I'm trying to say here.
Yeah, it's just like Node's compat concerns, though, typically mean that once we ship this and it's not behind a flag, it's not going to be changed, right? Because like CJS does not get changed in this way. I don't see why it's going to be any different after it ships.
That's not necessarily entirely true for what it's worth. So both, I believe, HTTP2 as well as workers, both had changes, like dramatic changes to their APIs after the flag was removed.
Right, but those were packages that were flagged as experimental, even though they were like effectively shipped. We're talking about a resolver and a module runtime that once it's unflagged, even if we say it's experimental and it starts getting used, I'm not sure that whether we say it's experimental will change the reality of the situation.
That's fair, and I think that's all part of the calculus that we'd have to calculate. I guess without getting too much more into the weeds right now, I can just ask a question. Does anyone object to removing this flag right now? So, Wes, what I do think could split the difference here, and thank you for being like flexible and open, is removing the flag on 13, but it will still remain behind the experimental modules flag on 12, does give us, and I know this is not preferable, but it does give us until 14 to make a drastic change. I personally would advocate that if we're having massive ecosystem problems around anything in the module loader, that doing so, like making drastic changes prior to April before we unflag on 12 and before we cut 14 are things that should still very much be on the table for this group and open to being explored. And that includes changes to the resolver, in my personal opinion.
No. By the way, on the subject of like dependency graphs and things that affect the ecosystem, how closely does the modules working group, like how closely are we expected to work with like say NPM, who wants to invert the meaning of peer dependencies again?
I think that we can work very closely with them, and if you have concerns about some of the peer dependency stuff that they've got going on, I would say we should spin up a separate issue, but we do have a direct line to quite a number of the people in the project there, and we can, schedule a call with them to discuss concerns.
I mean,
I'd be happy to chat with you about that as well, because that does not match my understanding of their plan. The meaning of peer dependencies is the same, and they're just trying to alter the usability of it. But we shouldn't discuss that on this call, I think.
Yeah, it's just like so I guess this is skipping ahead in the agenda to our chartering the modules team area. Is our charter supposed to include just being the custodians of like the coding core, or the custodians of like the ecosystem as a whole? Like, are we supposed to care about how things are constructed using the module system that we maintain?
I would say that is a great question. I would, if you're okay with it, like to punt it to the chartering discussion, which I'll make sure that we have time for today. And I would say that is the kind of question that we would answer in the process of chartering. And part of the reason why I actually think chartering would be so valuable, because we could come up with that scope. Because within Node, there's also there are a couple other initiatives that have to do with like ecosystem maintenance. And I'm trying to remember the name of the particular team. It will come to me probably in 7 minutes. That's how my brain works. But there is a team that's specifically focused on module maintainer needs that may intersect with. So, lots of different options there as far as what we could do. And Wes, I would say the scope of the group could be as large as we would like to try to charter it to be, as long as the TSC is willing to agree to that charter. So, as much as we want to take on and as much as they want to hand off, we just need to find that balance. And as long as we can reach consensus between the two groups, that is our scope. Wes, did that answer your question? Are you good to move on to the next item?
I mean, yeah, sure. I acknowledged I was going off on a tangent to a future agenda item already, just because it was a good segue.
Yeah, absolutely. And then really quickly, if we look at the agenda items for the rest, we have type detection, stabilizing the resolver, unflagging 12 LTS. Are people okay with, you know what, let's do unflagging 12 LTS really quickly right now, because I think that's more of an update, and then maybe follow it with the require ESM, because that's time sensitive. And then I would say chartering after that, before we get into stuff such as tabling source types, stabilizing the resolver, loader hooks, or patch instrument. Are people okay with that change of order? Okay, cool. So up first, unflagging 12.x LTS. So I think that we can drop this from the modules agenda as long as people don't see any problems. As a quick update, Targos did some work and got the V8 7.8 backport against Node 12 up. I worked through getting it tested and landed. The 12.x branch, there is now an open pull request for the next version of 12. Let me get that pull request into the chat for you all. That is for 12.15.0. Now, this release is still tentative. It is scheduled for the 28th, but it's possible that that date will change. Has over 250, it has 447 commits on it right now. But this weekend I spent some time and got the module loader implementation on there as close to the implementation on 13 as possible. It is my belief, but I could be wrong, that the only primary differences right now are internal behavior. There was one refactoring that was done by Joyi to remove cycles that I'm unsure if it got backported or not. But other than that, all the behavior should be exactly the same. It still has the experimental modules flag, but once you include that flag, everything else is the same as 13. So right now, conditional exports needs to land on the next 13, but we will backport that PR removing the flag. So conditional exports, self-referential modules, exports, everything is behind the experimental modules flag. Now, without the experimental modules flag, none of these features work for either CJS or ESM. That would be something that I know Jordan will care specifically about, that bug on 12, where exports got partially unflagged on CommonJS. As far as I can tell.
Was that on 12 or just 13.0 and 13.1?
Oh, I meant 13.0. Like, so the bug that landed on 13.0 and 13.1 is not present on 12. So we did not like accidentally partially unflag. Let me double check to see if there's an RC. Yet there isn't. I'll get an RC built and I'll drop the link into our tracking issue there for unflagging on 12. But it would be really great if people could test it both with and without the flag. I mean, we have a lot of tests on there, but like this kind of QA would be really great. So test it with your modules, make sure that it doesn't break existing modules, because without the flag, there should be zero behavioral changes aside from just the changes that are introduced in 12 with new libuv and new v8 and all that. But none of the changes that we've done to the loader should be present, especially since we have included the Bootstrap refactor. Outside of that, it would also be good to test all the things with the flag off. With the flag off, the module loader should behave identically to how it behaves on 13, is at least the intention. It is very possible that there's a commit or two that maybe got missed in the process, and that's why manually checking this stuff would be good. The intention now would be to continue updating the implementation in the monthly releases between now and April. And then in the April release, which would be the next scheduled Semver minor release, that we would remove the flag, barring any unexpected ecosystem problems that rise between now and then. Does anybody have any thoughts or concerns or just questions about the current state of things and plan?
Is there, so just if we decide on new features, like let's say we decide on a syntax, like a sigil for self reference, right? Between now and that time, obviously the lack of that wouldn't block anything, but if that something like that were to land in 13, what are the odds of it being back portable to 12?
100%. Unless they're relying on changes in V8 itself. So for example, a bunch of the updates that we had to do this time relied on the synthetic modules that landed in V8 7.8. So we waited because backporting them without that would have involved unwinding a ton of shit and would have just created a lot of extra work and made ongoing maintenance a problem. So barring, it being blocked on something else, the rules for LTS essentially are we can make changes, including breaking changes to flagged experimental things in a patch release. The more conservative approach for larger breaking changes to an experimental thing is to wait until December minor, but we can kind of take that on a case-by-case basis. But as far as I personally am concerned and as an advocate from modules to the LTS team, there is nothing that is on our roadmap and that we're working on that shouldn't be able to be backported in these regular monthly releases. And if anything, would be a problem for us not to backport because we really want this to be tested and the edges to be dealt with prior to unflagging in April. So I would push for backporting this stuff as soon as possible, potentially as soon as like not waiting for the 2-week period that we usually wait for backporting things. But that would be on a case-by-case basis.
Cool. And then I have a other related question. So I think I know the answer to this based on what you just said, but what is the appetite of everyone for trying to see if the exports field for CJS could be backported to Node 10 / is it even technically practical, what with all the V8 stuff you were talking about?
I would say no.
Okay. To which, both?
To backporting any of this stuff to 10 for
Okay.
a number of different reasons. Like it was a ton of work just to get it to 12, to be honest with you.
Okay.
We rely on a whole bunch of V8 related stuff that's not on Node 10. And then further, Node 10 goes into maintenance mode in April. And I would be, at least with 12, we have quite a bit of time in active LTS to patch any bugs or any problems as they rear their heads, which can sometimes take months. I would be uncomfortable with us backporting that stuff to 10. End of life.
So like even if I magically showed up with a PR that worked, not that I have that lined up, you're saying you would still be uncomfortable because of the short window before it goes into maintenance mode, and potentially because it's just CJS? Or
let me double check the dates and make sure I'm not wrong on this. So like if we look at 10, yeah, 10 maintenance starts in April 2020 and is end of life in April 2021. So to me, especially if this stuff is introducing instability, I actually think there's value in maintaining an LTS release of 10 that hasn't been touched by any of this work.
Right. So the reason I'm bringing it up is because just an hour ago in like some community somewhere, somebody was pointing out how exports isn't in Node 10 even, which is, not at end of life until next year. And they were using it as a reason why they prefer to use like rollup or something on their package, but with exports they won't have to, but then they'll have to wait until it's EOL. So if we could have backported that, but that sooner, then like the ecosystem can use it faster. But if not, then that's fine.
Yeah, but I think with that said, and then I see your hand, Corey, and I'll get to you in just a second. I think that's the whole purpose of having that main fallback. So yeah, like it's not ideal that they still need to use rollup and all that, but like you still can support exports and support non-export versions through the main entry point. And I think
right. I mean, the feature that I was specifically talking about is the inability to require things that aren't in the export map. Like it's like an encapsulation feature.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
That's the part that if it could be backported as far back as possible, then that drastically accelerates when the ecosystem can start considering that as an encapsulation barrier for all its supported nodes.
So I think with that in mind, we could potentially explore doing that. Although like the concern that I would have is that with 10 going into maintenance in April, we don't, and with this month's Semver minor release already kind of lined up, unless we were pushing to kind of do that, and like we are not even unflagging exports on 12 until April. It just feels, it feels odd to me. I like Wes's suggestion here that like 10 could potentially use a userland polyfill to replicate that.
Yeah, and I'm already in progress and working on that polyfill. So certainly that's what I will recommend in the meantime. But like everyone's comfort level with that sort of thing is different. So obviously, if it's not practical to backport to 10 for all sorts of reasons that you've mentioned, so be it. Then I can recommend people use the polyfill I'm in the process of making, and if not, then people will just have to do what they feel comfortable doing for the encapsulation they want.
Yeah, my gut is changing the resolver so late in the LTS is kind of off the table. Corey, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I just want to ask about the 12.x release. I had posted a couple of bug fixes to dynamic import resolve, and I got a message about one of them being backported, but not the other one. If I'm going to look it over, but if I find that one of them is not backported, what do you suggest?
I can backport it for you. Do you want to just drop the PR into the chat while we're going, and I'll just check that out of band right now, and I can let you know in a few minutes.
I'll look for that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Corey.
Thanks.
I
Jeffrey?
just wanted to ask what the latest update is on the timeline for what's going out in January and what's going out in April. Is the idea like everything except unflagging is going out in 12 backport in April or in January, and then all that we do in April is unflagged?
Yeah, that's what's already in the 12.15 pull request.
And what if we land any other new improvements or bug fixes to modules related stuff between January and April?
Maybe you were off the call, but earlier I mentioned we can continue to backport all of that stuff behind the flag in monthly releases.
Okay. Sorry, yeah, Zoom has been like just keeps kicking me out all morning.
Yeah, sorry. So we can do things in patch releases. It's not a problem. The only thing that needs to come in a minor is removing the flag or potentially very, very large breaking changes, but even the breaking changes can be debated.
Okay. I also had concerns about backporting pieces of this to 10, but if it's not really on the table, and I don't think we need to waste anybody's time with it. But
yeah, through the combination of V8 and the timeline on 10, I don't think that it's valuable for us to be spending time on that. But if someone wants to open an issue to discuss it separately, I think that it's very reasonable to have a more open discussion about it and not just kind of take my word at it right now.
Sure.
Cool. Anyone else on this topic before we move on?
Did we get the loader work in the backport or not?
For 12?
Yeah.
So what I'll do really quickly, and I think we should move on to the next issue, but I'll go and I'll quickly rerun branch diff and find out like what commits haven't landed. My understanding is that unless something was explicitly labeled to not land on 12, it should be backported. And similarly to what I was saying with Corey, if you have a specific PR in mind, if you drop the PR in the chat, I can quickly check to see if that has been backported yet.
Are you talking about the loader hooks guy?
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be good to land.
Has that landed on master?
Yeah, like a week or two ago.
Has it gone out in a 13 release?
No, I think it should be in the next one.
So then it possibly has not gotten there yet because it is not gone out in a 13 release. Because we don't tend to backport things until they have gone out in a release. And if those loader changes get missed in 12.15, they will be able to land in 12.15.1. Jan?
Quick question for the loader changes. What exactly, so quick question is, if the loader flag changes, does that affect our ability to unflag the loaders? Because right now it's, I think, dash experimental loader, so it will change its name. I assume.
What, when it standardizes or in the backport?
Well, the question is it okay if our unflagging in April in 12 not only drops the flag, but also changes the flag to pass loaders?
I think that it's absolutely fine. I think that in as long as these things are flagged, we can change absolutely everything until it's unflagged. As long as they're experimental, we can continue to change them. I think that the biggest thing that we do need to figure out, and this was something that I noticed we didn't do for experimental conditionals or for, I'm not sure, self-resolve. So this is something I just need to double check and maybe we want to fix. But like I don't know if we left aliases for old flags just as no ops, which is what we tend to do to make sure that there aren't so that if people had the flags, they don't need to remove them. But we can include silent aliases as well if it changes and we want to just be a little bit more conservative with the change. So we did that, for example, with the ES module specifier resolution flag. So that got changed to experimental specifier resolution, but we kept the ES module specifier resolution flag. It still works. It's undocumented. If you use it, it aliases to the other flag. Does that answer your question, Jan?
Yep.
Great. Is everyone good to move on to the next issue? Cool. This is an important one for us to get to. I'll hand it right off to Guy. This is number 468, LTS backporting of require ESM. Guy, do you want to take it?
Yeah. So on the backport, in the CJS resolver, we've got all the behaviors flagged under experimental modules. And then we also have these two error require ESM errors, which aren't currently flagged because we wanted to ship them out, and we always wanted to ship them out early. If you try to require a .mjs file, that you get an error. And secondly, if you try to require a JS file in a type module scope, you get an error. And when we do the backport, those are now errors that are going to hit on the 12th release branch. So if a user was doing either of those things, it's going to get that error now. So just wondering if that's something that we need to be concerned about. Should we change them to warnings? Should we make them apply behind the flag? And one of the things to bear in mind here is the reason why a user would ever get an error. I today just cloned the and tested it against requirements and some other things. It all works fine. The only time you really get the issue is if you happen to already be using type module or an MJS file in your workflow, even though you weren't quite using them properly. And it was sort of working, but not quite. So it's really the early adopters who are going to be hit. And that's just an unfortunate pain of that process. And ideally, we would have got the errors out even earlier. So I tend to think that maybe we just need to bite this one and accept it. But yeah, just to have a discussion around that and be aware that we may get bug reports.
Okay, cool. Do we have any sort of action on that as to what we should do? Is there any action item to be done?
When I originally posted it, I was under the impression it was breaking require ESM because before when I tested it in one of my projects, I was hitting it. When I tested it again today, it was fine. So unless we were to discover some library, so I mean, just watch the smoke tests, I think, as well. You know, if there's some really popular library that it hits or something, then that's a problem, but we need to let them know. But otherwise, a non-action, but just that we're aware of it.
Okay. So it seems to me, tell me if I'm wrong, that it's non-action, but something to be aware of.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, very cool. So the next thing that we have on the agenda here, looking really quickly, is chartering the modules team. 8 minutes doesn't seem like a lot of time to work on this. How do people feel about in a future meeting, potentially in 2 weeks' time, since the release schedule seems to finally have been stabilized, that we schedule like half the meeting to focus on this topic? Do people feel good about that?
Sorry, which topic did you just say?
The chartering of the group.
Yeah, that would be good to do once all this stuff about unflagging conditional exports and so on is behind us.
Okay, cool. And speaking about conditional, Guy, as a heads up, I just fixed the conflict, and I'm rerunning CI one more time on that PR.
Thanks.
No problem. I'll take the action item of landing that today because I know it's pretty late for you already. Jan,
I
you
was just about to ask you that.
Yeah, I think what I would say is that we had been kicking around the idea of chartering for many, many weeks. So I was wondering if there's a more aggressive thing where if there's nobody right now that has strong feelings against chartering, to make the proposal more concrete before we have the half-hour meeting.
That seems pretty reasonable to me. What do you have in mind in particular?
Well, for example, there's the question about scope, which seems like something we could kick off on GitHub.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe we should move the conversation to GitHub and have more of an explicit conversation about the scope, or maybe even like I can try to do it, but my time is limited. Does somebody want to pair with me on putting together like a high level list of the things that we need to do? Maybe Jan, do you want to work with me on that and perhaps
Sure,
something
can
to
do.
present for the next meeting?
Sounds
Cool.
good.
Would anyone else like to participate in that? Cool. Yeah, I know governance.
In the chartering discussion, sure.
Okay, Jordan, I will try to loop you in and find a time that works for the three of us to just have a working session. And then in the next meeting, we'll schedule 30 minutes of the 60 minutes to discuss the proposal with the group.
Sorry, I keep getting cut out, but yeah, I could join that too.
Okay, cool. I'll send out a doodle, or potentially, yeah, I'll send out a doodle with some times that work for me and Jan because I can see our calendars. So we can find one that works with Jeff and Jordan. Cool, we've got 5 minutes left. Feel like we don't have enough time to dig into the table source type detection conversation, so I feel like we should punt that to next time. Jeff, are you okay with that?
I mean, I think it's done. I guess just does anyone object to tabling it? You know, that's what the PR does. So it's like a one sentence PR. If anyone doesn't think we should table it or wants to discuss it further, I can leave it open, but it's been kind of no progress since like April. So I'm assuming we're done on that one.
Yeah, I still think that there's value in an API that's does something like this specifically. I guess it's not too different from like import meta resolve, but would just like give you the resolved format type that would be expected. That's a little bit different though from the API that you designed.
That was that PR that or not PR. I think there was an issue that I'll say it was Corey or Derek opened
Yeah.
about like get package type. That definitely I could see the value of, and maybe we should add that to the list. I don't know.
Yeah.
But
For
it
me,
seems like
I
we've
think
moved
get
much
package-
more towards that away from like source detection. So that's why I was thinking of closing this one.
Okay, if that's the case, then I'm +1 on at least removing that from the timeline. And I think in general, maybe this could be a larger conversation about like how we work, and that can be part of the chartering discussion, because I don't know if roadmap based timelines make sense anymore, but we should kind of think of ways of like properly consulting the team. So maybe that's something we can talk about in that chartering discussion. But
Yeah, I think that this one and then the conditional exports are like the only two things still open on the roadmap. So if we close this one now and then presumably conditional exports will be closed by the next meeting, and then it's like we can just retire the roadmap.
yeah, and then we have like a handful of like future facing issues that we're working on, such as require ESM and a few others, and we could maybe even just turn it into like a feature tracker instead of a roadmap.
Yeah, if we even needed a document for it. I mean, it could just
Yeah.
be the issues that are tagged or whatever.
Okay, so quickly to the group, does anyone object to landing this change to the roadmap? Cool, Jeff. I guess you can move forward with that, with landing that. I would just want to make sure, and maybe this can come in an additional PR, that like ideas that we're still exploring or something like that should be documented in the roadmap, because I would not want to lose the intention of the like get package type API, for example.
Yeah, maybe let's talk about that in the next meeting. We can figure out how we should organize that stuff.
Yep. Because I can think of a couple things such as loaders, require ESM, import meta resolve. Like we have a list of things that I think we're interested in working on, and it would be good to keep that documented.
And we still need to kind of figure out the remaining use cases for loaders that the current API doesn't support. Like I think all the things like stubs and the stuff that the testing like folks are coming at us with, like we need to kind of figure out either solutions for those or at least explanations for why they won't be supported. But one way or the other, I think we kind of need to deal with the biggest of those.
Yep. Sounds good to me. We've got 1 minute left. Anyone have any parting thoughts or concerns? Well, thank you everyone for joining. You know, I'd say this was one of our more productive meetings. Feels like we got a lot done. I'm really excited. Before we go, I just dropped a gist into the chat. For those who are following along at home, if you just go to gist.github.com/milesborns, it's my most recent gist. This is a run of branch diffs. So these are all the commits that are on 13 that aren't on 12 yet. So if you were concerned about certain things not being included, it would be in there. But from a quick gander, it looks like there's nothing module related in there.
Miles, one of the
update on that briefly as well. I did just do a few quick checks, and the last 3 PRs for modules that I landed weren't included in 12, and the loaders isn't on there.
My guess is, have they landed on 13 yet?
No, but I couldn't see them in this list either, unless I just scanned it too quickly now.
It would not show up on that. This is just a comparison of 12 to 13. When we're doing LTS auditing, we're only looking at the 13 branch.
Sorry, I misunderstood. I thought you were saying that this was the diff against master. Okay.
Yeah. All right, cool. I gotta.
Hey, Miles, one more thing. When you're gonna look at your and Jan's schedules to open the doodle for that other meeting, could you maybe open a doodle for discussing what would be the best time for everyone in the group for our regular meeting, in case we want to move it, or else we can keep
for
it.
what it's worth, if you want to take that action, and we just need to open an issue, and I would say make 2 weeks with an hour block through like general working hours for both weeks, so we can pick a time anywhere within a 2-week frame for a recurring meeting.
Okay.
I'm about to get kicked out of this room, so I gotta go. I'm killing the stream. Thanks for